Depression is often spoken of in fragments, as if it were nothing more than a dark cloud of sadness, a brain caught in a storm of chemical imbalance, or a temporary failure of motivation. Modern psychiatry tends to reduce it to neurotransmitters and brain circuits, prescribing pills to stabilize the imbalance. Yet, as Irvin D. Yalom and many other psychoanalysts have reminded us, this explanation, while not false, is deeply incomplete. To speak of depression solely in biological terms is like describing a fire only by its smoke. It misses the burning core. Yalom insists that depression often conceals something far more profound, existential conflicts that live at the very center of the human condition. These conflicts are not visible in brain scans, nor can they be silenced by medication alone. They are bound to questions of life and death, freedom and responsibility, isolation and belonging, meaning and despair. In his groundbreaking book, Existential Psychotherapy, Yalom wrote, "To the extent that one is responsible for one's life, one is alone. Responsibility implies authorship. To be fully responsible for one's life is to be fully alone." This is not the kind of phrase that makes it into a quick medical diagnosis, but it reveals something most people with depression feel at some level: the unbearable weight of having to carry a life that feels either empty or impossible to shape. Depression, in this sense, is not simply an illness to be eradicated, but a signal, a flare shot from the depths of our being that something essential is being ignored. Sigmund Freud, though often criticized for being pessimistic, once described melancholia as a kind of mourning turned inward. In Mourning and Melancholia, 1917, he observed that while grief for the dead is visible and socially acknowledged, the grief of depression is silent, unrecognized, and therefore corrosive. The patient, unable to name what has been lost, turns the aggression against the self. Here already we see that depression cannot be reduced to sadness. It is sadness mixed with a secret, a hidden loss of meaning or identity that eats away from within. Freud's insight prepared the ground for later thinkers like Yalom to ask the harder question: what exactly is being mourned in depression? Sometimes it is a relationship, sometimes a dream of the self, and sometimes even the illusion that life is simple and guaranteed. The existentialists pushed this insight further. For Yalom, the symptoms of depression, apathy, despair, fatigue, often mask the refusal to face what he called the ultimate concerns. These concerns, death, freedom, isolation, meaninglessness, are not optional parts of life, but unavoidable truths. When ignored, they return with a vengeance, often in the form of psychological suffering. Depression then becomes a messenger, carrying truths we would rather not see. The problem is that most of us treat the messenger as an enemy to silence, instead of a guide to listen to. Consider the patient who comes into therapy saying, "I just feel empty." Medication might numb that emptiness, but it does not answer it. Yalom would encourage the patient to sit with that emptiness, to ask what has been lost, what meaning has collapsed. Often underneath lies a buried fear of death, or a realization that life as currently lived is not truly one's own. Here, the depressive symptom is not an enemy, but an invitation. A brutal one, yes, but an invitation nonetheless to confront the structures of existence. Rollo May, another existential psychologist, once wrote in The Meaning of Anxiety that depression is the inability to construct a future. That single line captures why depression feels so suffocating. It robs us of time itself. When you are depressed, tomorrow does not exist. The past feels heavy, the present feels unbearable, and the future collapses into a blank wall. May's insight, echoed by Yalom, reveals depression as a crisis of temporality. To treat it, then, is not only to relieve symptoms, but to help the patient rebuild time, help them imagine again that tomorrow could hold something different, something chosen. This is where existential thought breaks from purely medical psychiatry. Pills can ease the symptoms, and often they are necessary to lift the crushing weight enough for a person to think clearly, but they cannot, by themselves, reconstruct a life. They cannot supply meaning. Yalom describes cases in existential psychotherapy where patients on medication still felt a gnawing void because the deeper questions, why am I here? What is my purpose? How can I bear the certainty of death? Remained unanswered. It was only through dialogue, through facing the terror directly, that healing began. And yet, facing these truths is not easy. Depression, paradoxically, often signals both the refusal to face reality and the desperate need to. Patients may say, I don't want to think about death, or I can't bear the thought of being alone. But it is precisely these unspoken fears that bind them in paralysis. The depressive fog is both a shield and a prison. Yalom believed that therapy must pierce that fog gently but persistently, helping patients see that what they fear most, the reality of death, the weight of freedom, the possibility of meaninglessness, is also the source of their liberation. For once we stop running, the fear transforms into clarity. Thus, the secret no one tells you about depression is that it is not just a malfunction, but a message. It is life insisting that something deeper must be addressed. To silence it without listening is to miss the opportunity for transformation. Yalom's work, alongside Freud, May, and Viktor Frankl, suggests that depression can be a doorway. Not a doorway anyone would willingly choose, but one that, once entered, can lead to a fuller, more authentic life. Frankl, in Man's Search for Meaning, wrote, in some ways, suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning. Depression, then, is not only suffering, it is an unfinished question, waiting for us to answer with our lives. Isolation is one of the heaviest burdens a human being can carry, and yet it is often invisible. We imagine depression as sadness or fatigue, but beneath those symptoms lies something more corrosive. The quiet terror of being cut off from others, unseen, and ultimately alone. Irvin D. Yalom described this not as ordinary loneliness, which can be remedied by company, but as existential isolation, the unbridgeable gap between one consciousness and another. No matter how close we come to another person, we remain, in the final analysis, separate beings. For many, this realization seeps into life as despair, as if every attempt to connect will ultimately fail. In the language of depression, this despair speaks as numbness, withdrawal, and the conviction that no one could ever truly understand. In existential psychotherapy, Yalom explains that the deepest anxiety is not death itself, but the awareness that we die alone. This idea pierces to the core of depression. When people speak of feeling isolated, they often mean not simply that no one is physically present, but that no one can fully enter their inner world. That unbearable solitude feeds depression, because it confirms the suspicion that one's suffering is unshareable, that the self is condemned to silence. The irony is that this belief, though not entirely untrue, can become a prison. The more we believe we cannot be understood, the less we risk reaching out. The less we reach out, the more isolated we become. Depression tightens its grip in that cycle. Psychoanalysts long before Yalom recognized this phenomenon. Donald Winnicott, for example, spoke of the unthinkable anxiety of being left alone without the capacity to hold oneself. He suggested that without a reliable, holding environment in early life, a mother or caregiver who could reliably mirror and contain the child's needs, individuals may grow up with a fractured sense of connection. As adults, they are prone to retreat into depression when relationships falter because those old wounds of isolation reopen. Winnicott's work shows us that depression is not only existential, but developmental. The failure of early connection echoes throughout a lifetime. Freud, too, in Civilization and Its Discontents, touched on the paradox of human life. We long for intimacy, yet civilization itself often isolates us, demanding repression of instincts and creating barriers between individuals. The depressive person often feels doubly trapped, cut off from society, yet also unable to return to some imagined primal intimacy. In this way, isolation becomes not only a social problem, but a fundamental condition of existence. The patient who says, "No one can understand me," is expressing more than self-pity. They are voicing a universal fear that human beings can never fully cross the gap between self and other. And yet, therapy attempts to bridge that very gap. Yalom emphasizes that while existential isolation can never be completely overcome, it can be eased through authentic encounter. When one person meets another with full presence, without masks or defenses, something shifts. The depressive person begins to feel, if only faintly, that they are not entirely abandoned in their inner world. This is why Yalom calls the therapeutic relationship itself the cornerstone of therapy. It is not interpretation alone that heals, but the living bond between therapist and patient. Viktor Frankl also recognized this dimension of depression. In Man's Search for Meaning, written after his survival in concentration camps, he recalled that despair often stemmed not only from hunger or fear, but from the loss of connection with others. Prisoners who felt utterly alone in their suffering deteriorated fastest. Those who could imagine speaking again with a loved one or who found meaning in solidarity endured longer. Frankl concluded that love, the act of turning toward another human being, is one of the most powerful antidotes to despair. His famous line, "Love goes very far beyond the physical person of the beloved. It finds its deepest meaning in the spiritual being," suggests that connection, even imagined, can relieve the sting of existential isolation. The modern world, however, intensifies this isolation. Social media creates the illusion of constant connection, yet leaves many people more depressed than ever. The depressive scrolls through endless images of others' lives, each photo a reminder of separation, of being outside the circle of joy. This paradox mirrors Yalom's insight. Connection must be authentic to heal. Superficial bonds only deepen the wound. Depression thrives where contact is hollow, where words do not reach the soul. But here lies the secret that no one often tells. Isolation is not only a curse, but also a teacher. When confronted directly, it reminds us of the preciousness of authentic connection. Depression forces us to ask, what kinds of relationships truly sustain me? Who sees me as I really am beneath my roles and defenses? For some, this question awakens a new hunger for intimacy that, once pursued, becomes the path out of despair. Yalom encourages patients not to flee from the truth of existential isolation, but to accept it and then to build bridges anyway, knowing they will never erase the gap, but that crossing even part of it is enough. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke once wrote, "Love consists of this, two solitudes that protect and border and greet each other." This idea echoes through Yalom's philosophy. Depression tells us that isolation is unbearable, and in some sense it is. But it also points to what we most need: relationships where two solitudes can stand side by side, without illusion, without pretending to be one, yet still joined. In practice, this means that healing from depression often begins not in grand answers, but in small acts of connection. A phone call, an honest conversation, a session in therapy where the patient risks saying, "This is how alone I feel," and the therapist replies, "I hear you." And in that moment, existential isolation is not erased, but it is softened. And in that softening, life begins to feel possible again. Thus, the silent weight of isolation is both the cause and the mirror of depression. It drags people into despair, but it also illuminates the path forward, toward authentic encounter, toward being truly seen, toward learning that while we are, in the deepest sense, alone, we are also together in that very aloneness. Yalom's gift, and the gift of psychoanalysis at large, is to remind us that isolation is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a search for connection that, when embraced, can transform depression into a gateway to deeper human intimacy. One of the most painful truths about depression is that it often arises not only from what life has done to us, but from what we have done or failed to do with life. This is a thought many people resist because it feels cruel to suggest that responsibility plays any role in their suffering. And yet, Irvin Yalom and the tradition of existential psychotherapy insist that depression cannot be fully understood without considering the burden of freedom. Unlike animals guided almost entirely by instinct, human beings are condemned to choose. Every day we are confronted with decisions, small and large, that carve out the shape of our existence. With that freedom comes responsibility, and with responsibility comes an often unbearable weight, the awareness that we are the authors of our own lives. For some, this realization is paralyzing, and depression becomes the shadow of choices not made, of lives left unlived. Yalom describes this dilemma in Existential Psychotherapy, writing, "If we assume responsibility, we must accept anxiety, and if we avoid anxiety, we must relinquish responsibility. Here lies a cruel paradox. To escape the anxiety of freedom, many retreat into depression. Instead of facing the terror of choice, they sink into paralysis, convincing themselves that nothing can be done, that they are victims of fate or circumstance. Yet beneath the surface, the psyche knows that choices were avoided, that freedom was abandoned. This buried awareness often feeds the self-loathing and guilt that accompany depression. The patient may not consciously articulate it, but in the depths of their despair lies the whisper, "I could have lived differently." This theme echoes Freud's early insights. Though he did not use the language of existentialism, Freud recognized that repression, the avoidance of truth, creates psychic conflict. In Civilization and its Discontents, he suggested that much human suffering comes from the demands we place upon ourselves and the choices we refuse to acknowledge. Depression, seen this way, is less a chemical error than a silent judgment, the psyche punishing itself for abandoned responsibility. Viktor Frankl sharpened this insight in Man's Search for Meaning. Having survived the concentration camps, Frankl observed that even in the worst conditions, human beings retain one freedom that cannot be taken, the freedom to choose one's attitude. He famously wrote, "Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances." For Frankl, depression often emerges when individuals feel robbed of this freedom, when they forget or deny that their response to life remains in their hands. While many patients protest, "I had no choice," Frankl insists that there is always some margin of freedom, however small. To recognize it is to reclaim responsibility, and in doing so, to weaken depression's grip. Rollo May also saw freedom as a double-edged sword. In The Courage to Create, he argued that freedom always brings anxiety, because to choose one path is to kill others. Depression often arises when the individual cannot tolerate this anxiety. Instead of choosing, they retreat into stasis. They may cling to a job, a relationship, or a lifestyle that feels safe, even as it suffocates them. Depression becomes the silent scream of freedom denied. May's insight was that healing requires courage, the courage to face anxiety and still choose, to create a life rather than drift through one. Consider the patient who says, "I feel stuck. My life is going nowhere." On the surface, this may look like external circumstance, a dead-end job, an unsatisfying relationship, a lack of opportunities. But Yalom would press deeper. What choices have been avoided? What responsibility has been evaded? Often the patient has been waiting for life to deliver meaning rather than authoring it themselves. Depression here is not just an illness but a refusal, a turning away from the terrifying freedom of shaping one's own destiny. Yet it is crucial to understand that this refusal is not a moral failure but a human reaction to terror. Freedom, when fully realized, is terrifying. To know that no one else can live our life for us, that we cannot outsource the responsibility for our existence, is overwhelming. Many respond to this terror by clinging to external authorities, parents, partners, religions, even therapists, to dictate how they should live. Others surrender to fate, saying, "It's out of my hands." Depression, in this sense, is the psychic cost of freedom denied, the emotional toll of handing away authorship. Yalom insists that healing begins with reclaiming that authorship. This does not mean blaming oneself for suffering, but recognizing one's capacity to choose within it. Even the smallest act of responsibility, deciding to attend therapy, deciding to speak honestly, deciding to confront a fear, begins to loosen the depressive hold. The patient learns that while they cannot control every circumstance, they are not powerless. Depression thrives on powerlessness. Responsibility restores a sense of agency. This is not easy work. Patients often resist it fiercely because it dismantles the comforting illusion that someone else is in charge. In the therapy room, this resistance often appears as anger. "Don't tell me it's my fault. Don't tell me I chose this." But Yalom's point is subtler. Depression is not chosen, but choices affect it. The refusal to take responsibility for life may not cause depression in every case, but it often deepens it. To acknowledge this is not to condemn, but to empower. For once we admit that we are responsible, we can begin to act differently. There is a haunting line in Jean-Paul Sartre's Being and Nothingness: man is condemned to be free. This is the essence of the burden Yalom speaks of. Depression often emerges as the desperate attempt to escape that condemnation, to deny the terrifying truth that freedom cannot be avoided. The challenge of therapy, then, is to help patients bear the anxiety of freedom rather than fleeing into despair. To show them that while freedom weighs heavily, it also opens the possibility of change. In the end, the secret that no one tells you about depression is that it often hides behind the mask of powerlessness. It whispers, "You cannot," when in truth the soul is saying, "You must choose." Yalom, Frankl, and May all remind us that responsibility is not the enemy of freedom, but its twin. Depression deepens when we run from that twin. Healing begins when we turn to face it trembling but resolute and say, "This is my life, I will bear it, I will choose." At first glance, depression appears to be about sadness, fatigue, or a loss of pleasure. But beneath these symptoms, many psychoanalysts have argued, lies a deeper and more frightening source of despair, the anxiety of death. This is not always obvious to the patient. Few come into therapy saying, "I'm afraid of dying." More often, they speak of emptiness, boredom, or a lack of motivation. Yet Irvin Yalom has long suggested that unspoken death anxiety often lurks beneath these complaints, shaping them in ways neither the patient nor society fully recognizes. Depression, in this light, becomes not only a mood disorder, but a disguised confrontation with mortality. In Staring at the Sun, Overcoming the Terror of Death, Yalom is explicit about this connection. He writes, "Though the physicality of death destroys us, the idea of death saves us. By this he means that death awareness, if faced consciously, can awaken us to life. But when avoided or repressed, it becomes toxic, fueling depression and despair. Patients may not name their fear of death, but it often manifests as paralysis, as if life were pointless. Depression is frequently the psyche's way of saying, I cannot bear the knowledge that all this ends. Freud, too, was fascinated by the role of death in human psychology. In Beyond the Pleasure Principle, he introduced the concept of the death drive, an instinctual pull toward dissolution and non-existence. While controversial, this idea suggested that depression may not only be about external losses, but also about an internal attraction to stillness, to the silence of death. Freud's contemporary Otto Rank expanded this further, describing birth trauma as humanity's first confrontation with separation and mortality. For Rank, every later anxiety carried echoes of this primal rupture, and depression often reflected a return to that unbearable tension between life and death. The connection between depression and mortality is also evident in how patients describe time. Rollo May once observed that depression often feels like the absence of a future. When a person cannot imagine tomorrow, they are already, in some sense, rehearsing death. Time collapses and with it vitality. This is why many patients describe depression as a living death, a numbness in which they feel both alive and already gone. Beneath that numbness lies terror, the recognition, often unconscious, that life itself is fleeting. Yet, paradoxically, the avoidance of death often deepens depression. Yalom recounts the story of patients who, terrified of mortality, tried to live as if death did not exist. They avoided the topic, denied their fears, and distracted themselves with busyness. But their unconscious knew better. The suppressed anxiety leaked out as despair. Depression became the price of refusal. Yalom believed that genuine healing required not the denial of death, but its acknowledgement. To look death in the eye, to accept its inevitability, was to free oneself to live authentically. This idea resonates with Viktor Frankl's reflections in Man's Search for Meaning. Imprisoned in Auschwitz, surrounded daily by death, Frankl concluded that mortality itself gives life urgency and meaning. Live as if you were living already for the second time, he advised, and as if you had acted the first time as wrongly as you are about to act now. For Frankl, awareness of death was not a curse, but a catalyst for deeper living. Depression, then, can be understood as the absence of this confrontation. When mortality is ignored, life feels empty. When it is faced, life regains weight. Consider the patient who insists, "Nothing matters, it's all pointless." To many, this sounds like nihilism, but Yalom would hear the muffled cry of death anxiety. What the patient may be unable to say is, "If I am going to die, how can anything matter?" Left unspoken, this thought rots into despair. Spoken aloud in the safety of therapy, it becomes a doorway. For once we admit that life is finite, we can begin to ask, how then shall I live? Depression begins to lift, not by erasing death, but by integrating it into life. Donald Winnicott's notion of the capacity to be alone also touches this theme. He suggested that mature psychological health involves the ability to sit with solitude without collapsing into despair. Part of this capacity, though he did not frame it in existential terms, is the ability to tolerate awareness of mortality. Those who cannot bear this awareness often retreat into depressive withdrawal, unable to face the silence that reminds them of death. Therapy, then, must gently cultivate the strength to remain present to life's impermanence without being overwhelmed. Cultural denial of death makes this task harder. In much of the modern West, death is hidden away, medicalized, sanitized, spoken of in whispers. People rarely see the dead, and conversations about mortality are avoided. The result is that individuals face their fear of death alone, without communal rituals to contain it. Depression often flourishes in this silence, because the unspoken cannot be shared. Yalom argued that part of the therapist's role is to reintroduce death into conversation, to normalize it as part of the human condition. By naming the unnameable, therapy releases patients from isolation. It is important to note that confronting death anxiety is not about morbid obsession. Rather, it is about transforming awareness of death into fuel for living. Patients who learn to face mortality often discover new urgency, passion, and appreciation. Depression, which once muted life, begins to dissolve as the patient recognizes that time is finite and precious. The key is not to deny sadness, but to see in it a hidden call to live more fully. In the end, the secret no one tells you about depression is that it often hides the fear of death. It disguises it as apathy, as emptiness, as disconnection, but beneath lies the same unspoken cry, "I am terrified of the end." Yalom's brilliance was to see that this cry, once brought into the open, does not destroy us. Instead, it awakens us. Depression begins to lose its grip when we stop running from mortality and instead allow it to teach us what truly matters. As Yalom himself once said, though the idea of death may fill us with terror, it is the very awareness of our finitude that can save us. Depression is often described as a state of emptiness, a hollowing out of the soul. Patients say things like, "I don't see the point anymore," or "nothing matters." On the surface, these may sound like symptoms of fatigue or hopelessness, but Irvin Yalom and other great psychoanalysts teach us that beneath such words lies a profound crisis of meaning. Depression, in this sense, is not merely about low mood. It is the collapse of the structures that once made life feel purposeful. And when meaning collapses, despair fills the void. Viktor Frankl, perhaps the most famous voice on this subject, knew this intimately. In Man's Search for Meaning, written after his imprisonment in Nazi concentration camps, he observed that prisoners who could no longer see meaning in their suffering withered and died more quickly than those who could. Those who held on to even a shred of purpose, a loved one to reunite with, a future task to complete, or even a memory to preserve, were more likely to endure. "He who has a why to live," Frankl quoted Nietzsche, "can bear almost anyhow." For Frankl, depression is the loss of this why. When people feel that life no longer holds meaning, existence itself becomes unbearable. Yalom too recognized this in his work. In Existential psychotherapy, he argued that the human being is meaning-hungry by nature. Unlike animals that live through instinct, we require stories, goals, and purposes to guide us. When those break down through loss, failure, or disillusionment, we enter an existential vacuum. Depression, then, is not only an illness of the brain, but of the spirit, a testimony to the collapse of meaning. Freud, though less focused on meaning, hinted at the same truth in Civilization and its discontents. He noted that human beings are uniquely dissatisfied, forever reaching for something beyond pleasure and survival. When culture or personal life fails to supply this sense of fulfillment, neurosis and depression emerge. Freud's pessimism led him to doubt whether lasting meaning was possible, but his recognition that emptiness breeds despair laid the foundation for later thinkers like Frankl and Yalom to push further. Rollo May went even deeper into this territory in The Meaning of Anxiety. He described how anxiety can be a signal, not merely of pathology, but of a crisis of purpose. Depression often follows when anxiety is ignored, when the individual refuses to confront the void and instead falls into paralysis. Yet May believed this confrontation could also be transformative. Anxiety about meaninglessness, if faced courageously, can become the seed of creativity. Depression, then, is not the end but the threshold of a possible new beginning. Consider the patient who has worked for decades only to retire and feel utterly lost. Their identity, once bound up in productivity, vanishes. Without meaning, they spiral into depression. Or the young adult who has achieved what they thought would bring happiness, a degree, a career, a relationship, but still feels empty. The external markers of success fail to provide an inner why. These patients often say, "I should be happy, but I'm not." Their depression is not caused by a lack of possessions, but by a lack of meaning. Yalom would argue that the path forward is not to supply meaning from the outside, but to help the patient create it. He rejected rigid formulas of purpose, believing instead that meaning must be crafted individually, in relationship with others, in acts of creativity, and in choices that affirm life. Therapy, in this sense, becomes a workshop of meaning-making, where despair is not silenced, but examined until it yields insight. Frankl described this process beautifully. He called it logotherapy, therapy through meaning. He believed that even suffering itself can hold meaning if we face it with courage. In the camps, he saw that those who could frame their pain as part of a larger narrative, whether spiritual, relational, or creative, were less likely to succumb to despair. Depression, when viewed through Frankl's lens, is not only a curse but also a call, a summons to discover or create a deeper why. This aligns with Yalom's insistence that depression should be understood as a question rather than an answer. When a patient says nothing matters, the therapist does not rush to contradict them. Instead, the therapist asks, what would make it matter? What has mattered before? What might still be possible? Depression, once engaged in this way, becomes less a wall and more a doorway, painful but necessary, leading to new forms of meaning. Donald Winnicott's ideas add another dimension. His concept of the true self versus the false self reminds us that meaning cannot be borrowed or imposed. Many people live according to expectations, family, culture, society, and eventually find themselves empty, depressed, because the life they are living is not truly their own. Depression becomes the protest of the true self, suffocated under roles and masks. Healing, then, is not about returning to the old life, but about creating one that resonates authentically. The cultural context also matters. In a society obsessed with consumption and achievement, many people equate meaning with success. When success arrives and the emptiness remains, depression follows. Yalom and Frankl remind us that meaning is not in possessions or status, but in relationships, creativity, and the courage to face existence honestly. Depression exposes the lie of materialism and pushes us toward a deeper search. Ultimately, the secret no one tells you about depression is that it is often a crisis of meaning. It signals that the old answers no longer work, that the why once sustaining us has collapsed. Though terrifying, this crisis can be transformative. As Yalom writes, the fact of death destroys us, but the idea of death saves us. In the same way, the fact of despair cripples us, but the idea of despair can awaken us to purpose. Depression becomes the dark soil in which a new meaning can grow if we are willing to dig. Thus, the journey from despair to purpose is not about eliminating sadness, but about listening to it. Depression asks the most human of questions. Why live? To answer it is to step back into life with renewed clarity. And in that act of meaning-making, the fog of depression begins to lift, revealing not a life free of suffering, but a life infused with purpose. In the quiet corners of despair, when depression feels like a cage without a key, many people believe that healing can only come from an external force, medicine, therapy, or a sudden change of fortune. While these elements are undeniably powerful and often necessary, Irvin Yalom and other great psychoanalytic thinkers argue that there is also something deeper at play: the human search for meaning, the healing power of connection, and the courage to face life even when it feels unbearable. This final step in our exploration is not about promising a miraculous cure, but about illuminating a path that others have walked before, and one that is open to anyone who dares to walk it. Yalom often insisted that the therapeutic encounter was not simply about treating symptoms, but about fostering an authentic meeting between two human beings. In his words from Existential Psychotherapy, the therapist must not shrink away from the issues of death, freedom, isolation, and meaninglessness. Instead, he must be willing to enter that territory alongside the patient. This notion of entering together is crucial, because healing is rarely born from isolation. It grows in the soil of shared experience, where another person is willing to sit with us in our pain, not as a savior, but as a witness. Viktor Frankl, in Man's Search for Meaning, wrote about surviving the horrors of Auschwitz, not by denying the suffering, but by finding meaning in it. He observed, those who have a why to live can bear with almost any how. For someone wrestling with depression, these words cut deep. The idea is not that suffering itself is noble or desirable, but that in the midst of suffering, life can still present opportunities to create meaning. A mother who continues for the sake of her children, an artist who transforms anguish into creation, or even a patient who simply endures another day, they all demonstrate that meaning can exist even in pain. Freud, despite being criticized for his pessimism, acknowledge the role of love and work, Leben und Arbeiten, as essential pillars of human fulfillment. Work gives us purpose, a reason to rise each day, while love binds us to others and affirms that our existence matters. For a depressed person, both may seem impossibly distant, but psychoanalysis suggests that rekindling even small sparks of these forces can gradually reignite the inner flame. Yalom's stories, especially in Love's Executioner, highlight that healing often arises not from grand revelations, but from subtle shifts. A patient burdened by guilt learns to forgive herself. Another, consumed by the fear of death, begins to live more fully precisely because of that awareness. These transformations are not sudden or magical, but they reveal a truth. When we confront our mortality, our freedom, our isolation, and our need for meaning, we can begin to live authentically, rather than merely endure existence. Healing, then, is not the erasure of depression. It is not the promise that one will never again feel its shadows. Rather, it is the capacity to live alongside those shadows without letting them define the entirety of one's life. As Carl Jung once said, "I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become." Depression may mark someone's history, but it does not have to dictate their future. The path toward healing also involves courage. The courage to risk connection when one feels unworthy of love. The courage to search for meaning when life feels devoid of it. The courage to get up in the morning when the weight of the night lingers heavily on the chest. Courage, in psychoanalytic thought, is not the absence of fear or pain, but the decision to live despite them. This is why Yalom emphasizes the therapeutic relationship as a microcosm of life itself. Within therapy, the patient dares to trust another human being, dares to speak truths they have never spoken, dares to be seen. This act, though seemingly small, is monumental for someone entrenched in depression. It demonstrates that isolation is not absolute, that connection is possible, and that one can, little by little, rediscover the will to engage with life. In the end, the secret about depression is not that it can be easily cured. It cannot. The secret, hidden in plain sight, is that healing emerges from meaning, connection, and courage. These are not abstract ideals, but living, breathing realities that anyone can begin to cultivate. It may start with a single conversation, a single page written in a journal, a single moment of noticing beauty in the world. It may feel insignificant at first, but these are the seeds from which healing grows. As Yalom reminds us, though the physicality of death destroys us, the idea of death saves us. Awareness of our finite time can awaken us to live more fully, to love more deeply, to forgive more quickly. Depression tempts us to withdraw from life, but the existential approach invites us to engage with it instead, to wrestle with its mysteries, and to find our place within them. For anyone listening who struggles in silence, your pain is real, your suffering valid, but you are not alone in it. Others have walked this path, and though their journeys were painful, many found ways to create meaning, to forge connections, and to summon the courage to live. This path is not closed to you. It is waiting quietly for you to take the first step. If this video resonated with you, don't leave without taking the next step. Hit subscribe and join our community where we explore the depths of the human mind together. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might inspire someone else silently struggling. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new insight that could transform the way you see depression, meaning, and life itself. Remember, you are not alone on this journey. Let's face it together, one step at a time.